Africa, the birthplace of humanity. Africa is where everything started, right? And we talk about that. And we talk about a place called Mali, because Mali was the last, they say the last great place, last empire in Africa, 1200, 1500 AD. In Mali, there was this city called Timbuktu. And in Timbuktu, there was a university called the University of Sankora. And in that university, they taught scholars from Europe. They taught philosophy, astrology, astronomy, music, all of those disciplines. And then those students from Europe, they would go back to their European homes. And a little later, they would say that they had discovered what they had learned in Africa. And the Africans seldom got credit for what they had developed. Similar to the, in Egypt, their Ethiopians and the Nubians brought civilization to Egypt, but Africans are seldom given credit for the Sphinx and the those tombs and the other things that are found in Egypt that people, you know, worship. Africans are not given credit for civilization of Spain in 711 AD. You know, so that's something that we just point out here. Africans seldom given credit for what they accomplished in Africa. Over here, this is kind of personal. This belonged to my husband. This is a Cameroonian robe, and all of these little things mean something, have some significance. When we were in Cameroon, we taught school, and on the weekends, I seldom saw my husband because he was being with Cameroonian men. Subsequently, he became part of the king's cabinet, the king's secret society. Now, how do you do that from the United States? You're part of the king's secret society. But he was a salesman for Prudential when we went, so maybe he used some of his salesmanship skills, you know. But he became part of the king's secret society. And the women made this robe for him. And when he wore this robe, people in the rural areas would bow down to him because it was so important. It meant that he was really an important person. And this is a picture of the king with he was head of the farming division, I think, too. And I think the people knew more about farming than he did, but I think because he was from the United States, you know, they thought he knew everything, right? But it was amazing. And here is the king here giving him, I don't know what that was, but that was an interesting event. This was made for him by some of the Cameroonian women. And all these little things mean something. He has another hat. After we left Cameroon, he'd have that hat on. He'd even sleep in it, right? He didn't get the people bowing down to him. He was back in the United States. I think he missed that a lot. But yeah, this is strictly Cameroonian. And I think if a Cameroonian person came in here, they would recognize it. This is another thing that's kind of personal. This is sheepskin, and this is Arabic. It was 2016, Timbuktu. I think they were trying to find out how many places in the United States were named Timbuktu. And so I think they elicited the help of a beautiful young woman who taught at Rutgers. She taught Black history, and she was the resource. She wrote to Mali. She started communicating with some of the students at one of the universities there. And it resulted in 4 or 5 of them coming over here for about a week. It was at the time that Mali, some of their resources had been taken from their museums and their universities. And they came, and we had a weekend at the high school in Mount Holly, where they talked about what was going on in Mali. Isn't that something, Timbuktu? So they were people of they're Muslims, and it was just like meeting somebody, your cousin or something from South Carolina. You know, we were hugging each other and everything, but it was a wonderful, wonderful weekend. They came here. They spent the last night here in one of the big rooms, and with them was very black man, old man with beautiful robes. And he didn't speak any English, but he had his French interpreter talk for him. And he spoke about how he was proud of us Africans here in America and how we had conducted ourselves, you know, and just tears just running down your face. But the fact that people from Mali came here and spent 4 or 5 days here, and they were here as a result of the advisory committee, Timbuktu, inviting them. So that was great. And that was this conversation about this. 1452, this is before Columbus. This is the person, Pope Nicholas V of the Roman Catholic Church. He is the person that we credit the European slave trade with. He is the one that gave the countries of Portugal and Spain the right to go into Africa, take over all the people, the land, and make the people slaves forever, perpetually. This man, this was the time of making Europeans, making empires, going around, and they say seeking a new trade, new ways to India. But I think mostly it was trying to take over properties and, you know, develop empires. I think that's what it was all about. He is the one. The Portuguese and the Spanish took him up on it. They went into South America and other places, and more Africans taken to Brazil than brought to America in that first group of, you know, taking us out of Africa. In Brazil now, they still have the segregation based on color. And they have a man who was president recently who is bent on law and order. So the Brazilians of color, poor, and they have a hard time there, Brazil. This is an artist's idea of how we were probably sold by heads of African states. After he made his, you know, announcement about, you know, those countries could go in, missionaries were sent to some places in Africa. And then troops were sent. And in the interim, the missionaries talked to heads of states, and they convinced heads of states to sell some people. That those some people were not their own people. That some people were people who had been at war and had been made slaves because of the war. Like if you and I were at war and I lost the war, then I would become your slave for 5 years, and then I would be free. The most important thing to remember in this case is that those people did not sell their own people. They sold people who were enslaved by them because of war. That happened so long ago. Most of the countries did that. If you were enslaved in this kind of situation. It would be for about 5 years, and then you'd be free. And your whole humanity would be intact. You would know your culture, and you could still appreciate your culture. But in our case, we were enslaved like forever. And wherever we were enslaved, our African culture was demeaned, or we weren't taken with demeaned, and the European culture was replaced it. We were the same people, just dropped off at different places. If we were dropped off in Haiti, we had to speak French, right? And take on some of the French culture. Dropped off in Brazil, we had to speak Portuguese and forget about our African culture. This is photo, copy of a photo taken in 1835. Photography was emerging there in 1835, and this is an actual photo. This always gets me. This is a copy of a painting, and it shows our people being taken from their villages. And we talked about this before, taken from their villages and walking 20, 30 miles in chains to get to a place like this. This place is called Elmina, and it's on the Atlantic coast of Ghana, built by the Portuguese. And the Portuguese, as we said before, would be up here on Sunday celebrating or praising God and singing hymns and praises. And our people would be down here in darkness, like in holes, not knowing what was going to happen to them. Amazing things. And sometimes the men would come down here and abuse the women. The men and the women would be separated. You could be married, but you couldn't be with your husband. And even if you were married, if a man up here wanted to seduce you, he could come down here, take you up here where the Portuguese were situated, clean you up, and then, whatever he wanted to do with you. The men were also abused. The history books don't talk about how our men were abused and children were abused in places like this. This is now what we call a tourist attraction on the Atlantic coastline of Ghana. And my daughter went there when the Ghanese were celebrating their 50th freedom anniversary. And she went in there and she said, as soon as you get in there, you can feel the spirits of the ancestors. You can almost smell urine and blood. And she said, it's really a terrible, terrible place, And inside this place, there was a book that described what this place was like. And they had one room that they set aside for people who were dying, or people who were they didn't like, who were making too much problem for them. And the people did die in that room. That's called Elmina. And our people would be there for 2 or 3 months in that terrible situation before boats would come and take them. But all along the Atlantic coastline of West Africa, there were places like this that held us, right, all along, until a boat would come along, load us up, and take us to our destination. We got to the destination, then, we would be put on the block to be sold. And this is an artist's idea of the ships that took us to our destination. We were like sardines. Sometimes the people would have us up on deck to dance, so that we would have a little vitality, so that when we arrived at our destination, we'd be somewhat alive, and we'd get a better price for our people who were enslaving us. So many of our people died during that Middle Passage. Some committed suicide There were cases where people 10 or 11 just held hands and just went into the water. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. There's a religion where one of the deities is a water. They call her Mommy Water. And some of the people, I'm going to Mommy Water. Mommy's going to take care of us. That's how they committed suicide. But a lot of people were thrown into the water to lighten the load of the boat. And many people were ill. And some of our people did die on the boat. These are the African homelands. This is where we came from. This is the Atlantic Ocean. And these are the names of the nations. We don't say tribes anymore. We say nations. These are the names of the nations, and these are the names of the current that we've given the current states in Africa. They came from Ghana, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Angola, Central African Republic, Cameroon. A lot came from Cameroon. A lot of our people came from this area. A lot of sales of Africans documented in this Dahomey, Benin, Angola. We were people of many cultures, religions, languages, tradition, and physical stock. We were the pygmies, the little ones, and we were the Zulus, the most beautiful specimens of humanity. We weren't all black like me, hair like mine. We were different colors, of different shades of brown, and different textures of hair. Where we came, though, they all described us as being very black and, like beasts. And I always say that in 1400, I can imagine how the Europeans felt when they saw us. We were very, angry and very excitable, and we spoke all these different languages they were not used to. And I can understand how they felt a little uncomfortable and, how they called us beasts, right? But 100, 200 years later, I can't understand that. I can't understand how they would call us beasts when we were taking charge of their plantations, where some of the men were marrying our women, and some of the children of the plantation owners were theirs. I can't understand how they could use those irons on a person, how they could feel the fear and see the anguish and the hurt and still do it, still do it. So that's a lot of things I don't understand about slavery.